The hiss of the steam engine was a sound of finality. It was the sound of a door closing on one life and, Caleb Thorne hoped, opening onto another. He ducked his head low to step from the passenger car onto the windswept platform of Dry Willow, Colorado. And the cold hit him like a physical blow. It was a high country cold, thin and sharp, slicing through his worn wool coat and settling deep in his bones. The year was 1887, and winter had already claimed the Rocky Mountains. The station was little more than a wooden box with a tin roof that rattled and groaned under the assault of the wind. A handful of people waited on the platform, their faces pinched against the cold, their breath pluming in the air. They watched him descend, their eyes traveling up the considerable length of him. At 6 feet and 7 inches, Caleb was used to the stares. He was used to the sudden silence, the nudges, the whispers. He had learned long ago to meet their gazes with a quiet steadiness, a simple acknowledgement that, yes, he was a large man, and now that the fact was established, they might all move on to more important matters. He carried a single, heavy canvas bag that held all his worldly possessions, a change of clothes, a whetstone, a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, and the heavy, custom-made hammers of his trade. His hands, calloused and scarred from 1,000 fires, gripped the bag's handle. He was a blacksmith, a drifter who had finally grown tired of drifting. He had answered an advertisement for a town smith in Dry Willow, a position that came with a forge and a small attached cottage. The letter of acceptance, signed by a Mrs. Margaret Pike, was folded carefully in his breast pocket, a fragile paper promise of a place to belong. A woman detached herself from the small cluster of townspeople and marched toward him. She was handsome, in a severe sort of way, with her hair pinned in a tight, unyielding bun and a fur-lined coat wrapped snugly around a formidable frame. Her chin was held high, a clear sign of a person accustomed to being in charge. This had to be her. He set down his bag and removed his hat, a gesture of respect his father had beaten into him. The wind immediately tore at his dark hair. Caleb spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to get snagged by the wind. "I am Caleb Thorne. I am here about the blacksmith position." Margaret Pike stopped a few feet from him, and her eyes, small and sharp, performed their own inventory. They started at his heavy work boots and climbed, and then climbed some more, until they finally reached his face. A flicker of disbelief, then something harder, crossed her features. She looked from him to the station master, a thin, harried man named Ernest Hadley, and then back to Caleb. "Good heavens," she announced, her voice carrying with it the crisp authority of a town council member and the owner of the Pikes Mercantile. "You are immense." Caleb felt a familiar tightening in his gut. He had been so careful in his letter. He had written it plainly a man of considerable size, standing 6 feet and 7 inches. He had wanted no surprises. He said simply, "I am." "This will not do," she declared. "Not to him, but to the entire platform. The position requires a man of respectable proportions. The cottage is built to a normal scale. The forge itself, this is an absurdity." A nervous titter started in the crowd. Caleb's jaw hardened. He could feel the warmth of shame creep up his neck. He kept his eyes on her, refusing to look at the others. "Ma'am, in my letter I made my height clear." "Your letter?" She sniffed, reaching into her handbag and producing a folded piece of paper. "Mentioned you were a tall man. It said nothing of this." She held it out as if it were evidence of a crime. Caleb saw the tear along the crease of the envelope, the smudge of ink that did not look like his own careful script. But his mind could not fully process it. The nervous titter in the crowd blossomed into open laughter. It was not a kind sound. It was the laughter of a small, closed community presented with an unexpected spectacle. The giant who came for a job and was too big to fit. It was a fine joke. It would be told over pot-bellied stoves for weeks. The sound washed over Caleb, each chuckle a small, sharp stone against his pride. He felt 100 feet tall and an inch high, all at the same time. "The position is no longer available to you," Margaret Pike said with an air of finality. She turned her back on him and addressed the station master. "Ernest, see that he is on the next train east. We will not have him lingering." And with that, she marched back toward the town, her duty done, leaving Caleb Thorne standing alone on the platform, his hat in his hand and the sound of laughter echoing in his ears. The train whistle blew a mournful goodbye as it began to pull away, taking with it the last of his hopes. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to spread the news. Only the station master remained. Ernest Hadley scratched at his beard, a look of weary pity on his face. "Well," he said, his voice raspy from the cold, "that was a thing." Caleb did not reply. He pulled on his hat and stared down the tracks, which were already disappearing into the swirling snow. The thought of getting on another train, of going anywhere, felt like a profound defeat. He had spent his whole life moving on. He was so tired of it. "Come on, big man," Hadley said, his tone more practical than kind. "Can't leave you to freeze. Next train ain't until morning, and there is a blizzard blowing in. I can see the gray mare's tails over the peaks." Caleb picked up his bag. The weight of it felt heavier now. Where am I to go? The boarding house beds won't be long enough. He knew this from bitter experience. Hadley nodded. "Reckon not. Let's go see the Reverend. Harlan Whitaker will know what to do. He is a practical man of God, finds room for all sorts." Caleb gave a single, stiff nod and followed the station master. As they stepped off the platform, a woman was walking past, carrying a basket of winter greens. She was of average height, with a plain, strong face and hair the color of autumn leaves tucked under a simple bonnet. She slowed as she saw him, but her gaze was different. It was direct, without mockery or awe. Her eyes met his for only a second, and he noticed a long, puckered scar that traversed the back of her left hand, the skin shiny and tight. She spoke, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the wind. "You stand tall, but you look a man straight. That is enough." Then she was gone, her worn boots making little sound on the snow-dusted boardwalk. The words hung in the air, a strange and unexpected comfort. Caleb did not know her name, but he held on to her words as a drowning man might cling to a piece of driftwood. The walk through Dry Willow was a quiet torment. Faces appeared in frosty windows. Doors opened a crack and quickly closed. He heard the whispers. The word giant passed from one person to another. He saw Deputy Constance Porter, a woman with a hard face and a badge pinned to her coat, standing outside the mercantile, talking with Margaret Pike. They both watched him pass, their expressions cold and unified. It was clear that order, in this town, was whatever Mrs. Pike decided it was. They passed a darkened blacksmith shop. Caleb stopped for a moment, peering through the grimy window. He could see the great anvil, silent and cold. He saw tools hanging on the wall, and on a workbench, a pair of rusted handcuffs with a broken chain. He felt a kinship with the place. Another thing abandoned and left to rust. Hugh Morrison, the old smith, had finally been beaten by the ache in his joints, or so the advertisement had said. Reverend Harlan Whitaker was a man whose hands looked as calloused as Caleb's own. He was building shelves in the church basement when they arrived, and he greeted Caleb with a handshake and a straightforward assessment. "Ernest tells me you're in a tight spot," he said, his eyes kind, "and that our town's welcome was less than Christian." "It was honest," Caleb replied. "The Lord provides," the Reverend said with a dry smile, "but sometimes he uses a dusty cot in a church basement. It is warm enough, and the roof does not leak. You can stay the night. We will figure out the morning when it comes." The cot was, as Caleb had expected, a good foot too short for him. He sat on its edge in the quiet, lamp-lit basement, the scent of sawdust and old hymnals in the air. Outside, the wind had begun to howl in earnest, hurling pellets of snow against the small, high windows. The blizzard had arrived. There would be no leaving tonight, even if he wanted to. And he did want to. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to put Dry Willow and its laughter behind him and never look back, to let the memory of Margaret Pike's dismissive face be buried by miles and time. Shame was a bitter meal, and he had been forced to eat it in front of a whole town. But then he thought of the woman with the scarred hand. You stand tall, but you look a man straight. It was a simple observation, but it had felt like a judgment of character, not of size. It was a sliver of dignity offered when his own had been stripped from him. He laid back on the cot, his feet hanging far off the end, his head pillowed on his folded coat. He could not leave, not like this. To leave now would be to let the laughter win. It would be admitting that he was what they saw a freak, a joke, a man who did not fit. He had been run off from places before, by suspicion and fear, but he had never been laughed out of a town. He would not let this be the first time. He did not know what he would do in the morning. He had no job, no money to speak of, and a town that had already rejected him. But he would not run. He would not let a single moment of humiliation chart the course of his life. He would stay. He would face the morning, and he would stand tall. The blizzard lasted 2 days. For Caleb, they were days of purpose. He woke before dawn on the cot that was his rack, his feet cold where they hung over the edge, and found that the small stove in the Reverend's office fought a losing battle with the chill. He understood the language of fire and draft better than the language of men. Before the Reverend was even awake, Caleb had disassembled the stovepipe, cleaned out a bird's nest and a decade of soot, and reassembled it. The stove drew clean and hot, and the office was warm for the first time since the snows began. Reverend Whitaker found him examining a leak in the fellowship hall's roof, a dark stain spreading across the pine ceiling. The Reverend, a man who believed faith was best expressed through sound works, simply handed him a bucket of tar and a hammer for the price of his shelter. Caleb made himself useful. He was not a man who could abide charity. Work was his currency, and he spent it freely. His largest task was the bell tower. The old rope was frayed, a whisper away from snapping. To climb the tower was to embrace the wind. The ladder was a skeleton of ice, and the platform at the top offered no shelter from the gale that swept down from the high peaks. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his size no hindrance in the vertical world. Below, figures a little larger than ants moved behind the steamed windows of the town's buildings. Watching him, he was a spectacle. The giant on the church steeple, he ignored them. He was not doing this for them. He was doing it for the integrity of the bell, for the clean, honest mechanics of a rope and a wheel. He knotted the thick new rope with hands that were steady and sure, his face raw from the cold, and when he was done, he gave the rope a single, testing pull. The bell sang out, a clear bronze note that cut through the howl of the wind. It was a new voice. Later that afternoon, as he sat by the newly potent stove, trying to work the chill from his fingers, the church door opened. It was the woman from the station, the one with the scarred hand. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "The bell sounds strong," she said. It was not a compliment so much as a statement of fact. She set the bundle on the table. "My name is Ruth Callahan. I brought you some bread." She unwrapped it. The loaf was still warm, the crust a perfect, deep brown. Next to it was a small jar of strawberry jam, its color a defiant jewel against the gray day. Caleb nodded his thanks. Feeling awkward and oversized in the small office, he did not know what to say to her. She looked at him with the same directness as before. It is not easy being the thing everyone looks at. He considered her words. "No," he said finally. "It is not." He glanced at her left hand, which rested on the table. The scar tissue was old, silvered, a map of some past pain. He wondered if she understood more than she let on. "People like to have things fit," she continued, as if speaking to herself. "They want the jars to be the same size on the shelf, the fence posts to be the same height. Anything different, it unsettles them, makes them think the whole shelf might come down." "And you," he asked, his curiosity overriding his caution, "are you unsettled?" She met his gaze, and a small, rare smile touched her lips. "I have found that the things that do not fit are often the strongest, the crooked tree limb that bears the most fruit, the stone that is the wrong shape for the wall but the right shape for a foundation." She picked up her empty cloth. Enjoy the bread, Mr. Thorn. It is a poor welcome compared to the one you were given at the station, but it is a warmer one." She left as quietly as she had come. Caleb sat with the silence, the warmth of the stove, and the smell of fresh bread. He felt a crack in the wall of his solitude, a small ray of light finding its way in. The blizzard broke on the third day. The world outside the church was a landscape of white, muffled and clean. With the sun came a visitor. Hugh Morrison, the town's retired blacksmith, appeared at the church, leaning heavily on a hickory cane. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and his knuckles were swollen knots of pain. "The Reverend says you know your way around a fire," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I do," Caleb answered. "Words are cheap. The bell rope is good work, I will grant you that. But rope is not iron." He pointed a gnarled finger at Caleb. "I need a new set of fireplace tools. My old ones are worn to nothing. You make me a set, a poker, a shovel, and tongs. If they are any good, we can talk. If they are scrap, you can be on your way." It was a test. Caleb understood. He nodded once. "I will need the key to the forge." The old smith tossed a key onto the table. "Do not burn my shop down." The forge was as he had seen it through the window, cold and silent. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the dirty panes. He swept the floor, laid out his own hammers, and surveyed the iron stock. He chose a length of plain bar stock and fired up the bellows. The fire was a living thing, and he fed it coal until it roared, a hungry, orange heart in the gloom. For the rest of the day, the ring of a hammer on an anvil returned to Dry Willow. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, a heartbeat for the town that had been silent for too long. Caleb worked. The sweat ran down his temples, and the muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and released. This was his sanctuary. Here, his size was an asset, his strength a tool. He was not a giant. He was a smith. The iron bent to his will, glowing and malleable under his hammer. He did not just make the tools strong, he made them right. He gave the poker a simple, elegant shepherd's crook for a handle. He shaped the tongs to grip a log with perfect balance. On the handle of each piece, he added a subtle twist, a small flourish that was his signature, the mark of a craftsman who took pride in his work. That evening, he needed a hot meal. The only place serving was the Silver Bell Saloon. He had to duck to get through the door, and the low conversations immediately ceased. He felt the familiar pressure of a dozen pairs of eyes. He walked to the bar, his shoulders instinctively hunched, trying to make himself smaller. He ordered a plate of beef stew and a coffee, pointedly ignoring the whiskey bottles that lined the back bar. A man at a nearby table spoke loudly to his friend. "That is a big thirst for a man with no job." His friend snickered. Maybe Margaret Pike should have measured the doorway before she sent for him. Caleb did not turn. He kept his eyes on his stew, chewing slowly, making each bite last. He felt the heat in his face, but he would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He was a mountain. The wind could howl, but it could not move him. The next morning he took the finished tools to Hugh Morrison's cottage. The old man took them, his expert hands turning them over and over. He tested the weight, the balance. He ran a thumb over the twists in the handles. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he looked up at Caleb, his eyes clear and sharp. "They will do." He grunted. He walked over to his mantelpiece and threw his old, bent tools into the woodbox with a clatter. He placed the new set on the hooks. They looked like they belonged there. "The forge is yours to use," the old smith said. "There are jobs backing up, horses to be shod, wagon wheels that need new iron. I can no longer do the heavy work. You will do it. We will split the profits. 60 for you, 40 for me. It is my shop." It was more than fair. It was a lifeline. Thank you," Caleb said. "Do not thank me," Morrison grumbled. "Thank the iron. It does not lie." From her mercantile window, Margaret Pike watched Caleb walk back toward the forge, his long strides eating up the ground. Deputy Porter stood beside her, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. "A big man makes a big shadow," Margaret said, her voice tight. "They can be disruptive. Men who are too honest or too large. They never seem to know their place." Constance Porter nodded in agreement. Order is a delicate thing. Later, Reverend Whitaker stopped by the forge. He admired a set of hinges Caleb was working on. "Your hands are a gift from God, son," he said. "It is good to see this place alive again." He sighed, looking toward the far end of town. "I only wish we could find a way to fix the water tower at the Juniper Orphanage. The main supports are rotting through. It is a tragedy waiting to happen. But the town council says there is no money, not a penny to spare." That night, Caleb lay on his cot in the church basement. His feet still hung off the end, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the ground solid beneath him. He had a place to work. He had a partnership, not a handout. He had earned his keep. The laughter from the train station had not disappeared, but it had grown quieter, its echo fainter. He had stood his ground, and the ground had not given way. The meeting was held in the church, not for worship, but for the stark arithmetic of survival. Reverend Whitaker stood before the assembled townsfolk, his face grim in the lamplight. The subject was the Juniper Orphanage. Its water tower, a rickety sentinel against the sky, was failing. The main timbers were riddled with rot, and the tank itself wept a steady, frozen trickle down its side. More than that, the town's fire bell, a separate issue but now linked by the common thread of crisis, was housed in a decaying belfry atop the mercantile. Its pull rope had snapped a month ago. Dry Willow had children with no clean water and a town with no voice to warn of fire. A contractor from Junction City had been summoned. His quote, when the Reverend read it aloud, was met with a collective groan. It was a king's ransom, a sum the town simply did not have. The silence that followed was heavy with despair. Into that silence, a low voice spoke. "I can build the tower." Every head turned. Caleb Thorne stood near the back, his massive frame seeming to shrink the room. He had not intended to speak, but the words had come of their own accord. Margaret Pike, seated in the front pew like a queen holding court, gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You a drifter building a 20-foot tower over the heads of our children, the idea is preposterous." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the Reverend. "My father was a shipwright. He built masts that had to withstand hurricanes. He taught me about stress and load, about braces and joints. I can draw the plans. I can lead the work." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "I will charge no fee for my labor. All I ask is that the town provide the materials at cost." A murmur went through the room. It was an offer of such simple, profound generosity that it left no room for suspicion. Mr. Samuel Boone, the stout, balding owner of the hardware emporium, stood up. His voice was firm. "If he is providing the labor, then Boone's Hardware will provide the nails, bolts, and iron strapping at my cost, not a penny of profit." A farmer named Jack Peterson, his face weathered from 1,000 suns, rose next. "I have got a good stand of pine on my north section. It is straight and true. I will donate the timber. My boy Daniel and I will help with the felling." Young Daniel, a lanky youth of 17 who was more ambition than muscle, beamed at the chance for purpose. It was a turning point. The despair in the room was being replaced by something else, something fragile but fierce, a flicker of shared resolve. Margaret Pike's face hardened. She saw control of the situation, and by extension the town's opinion, slipping from her grasp. "This is highly irregular," she announced to no one in particular. "Unsupervised, dangerous. Deputy Porter. Surely you see the risk." Deputy Constance Porter, ever the echo, nodded gravely. "The safety of the community is my primary concern. An amateur structure of that size is a significant liability." But the tide had turned. The Reverend Whitaker held a vote. A forest of hands went up in favor of Caleb's proposal. Only a small, stubborn cluster around Mistress Pike kept their hands down. The work began the next day. Caleb drew the plans in charcoal on the wide, smooth planks of the church hall floor. It was a thing of simple, powerful geometry, a skeleton of timber and iron designed for strength and longevity. He remembered his father's credo measure 3 times, cut once. Ruth Callahan appeared at midday, as she often did, with a basket of food. This time it was a thick stew, hot and rich, and fresh biscuits. The men, Caleb, Samuel Boone, Jack Peterson, and young Daniel, stopped their work and ate gratefully. Ruth did not hover. She studied the charcoal drawing on the floor, her head tilted. She pointed with the toe of her boot. "Your main supports are strong, but the wind here comes down from the pass like a fist. It will want to twist the tower." Caleb looked from her to the drawing. He had accounted for the downward load, the sheer weight of the water. He had not given as much thought to the lateral force of the wind. "My father built barns," she said simply. "He always used cross-bracing, from this corner to that one, and that corner to this one. It makes a box into a triangle. A triangle is the strongest shape there is." It was sound advice, born of practical knowledge. It would take more timber, more time, but it would make the tower unmovable. He looked at her, a deep respect dawning in him. "Thank you," he said. "That is good sense." Her quiet smile was his reward. They set to work with renewed vigor, a small community of sweat and sawdust. There was an easy humor between them. Samuel Boone, a man more used to counting inventory, hammered his thumb and let out a string of curses that made the Reverend, who had come to inspect the progress, blush. Young Daniel, eager to prove his worth, tried to lift a beam that was too heavy and ended up on his back in a snowdrift, laughing at his own foolishness. Caleb led them, his strength and skill a quiet, constant presence. He worked harder than any of them, his movements economical and precise, his great hammers driving home spikes with a single, perfect blow. The first problem came from the supply chain. The pump and valves they needed had to come from Junction City. When Samuel Boone sent the order, the reply was bleak. The Copperjack Gang, a band of opportunistic ruffians, had been seen along the Devil's Backbone Pass. The freight wagons were refusing to run until the sheriff dealt with them. Deputy Porter used the news as a weapon. She addressed a small crowd outside the Mercantile. "I warned of this. The project is stalled. It is a perfect example of what happens when we rely on transience and goodwill instead of proper planning. We should postpone this until spring, when the pass is clear and we can hire a licensed contractor." Caleb heard the news not with despair, but with a surge of grim determination. He went to the forge. If the parts would not come to him, he would make them. For 3 days, the forge was a miniature hell of fire and steam. He worked from memory and mechanical instinct, using pig iron and salvaged parts. He did not just copy the design of a standard pump, he improved it. He knew the winters here were brutal, that freezing water could crack cast iron like an eggshell. He forged the valve casings with thicker walls and designed the seals with a compressible leather gasket that would allow for the expansion of ice without breaking. He was not just building a part, he was solving a problem. He hammered and shaped the glowing metal, each strike of the hammer a declaration of defiance. The red-hot rivets he made to join the pipes were symbols of a will forged in fire. Young Daniel, who had become Caleb's shadow, watched in awe. One afternoon, he came to the forge, his face troubled. He had been sent to the Mercantile for kerosene. "I heard something. Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice low. "What did you hear, Daniel?" It was Deputy Porter, talking to Mistress Pike. The deputy said, "She said the handwriting on that first letter, the one you sent about the job, she said it looked more like the post office clerk's writing than it did yours." Caleb stopped his work, the hammer held motionless in his hand. The post office clerk, a man with a reputation for petty gossip and a fondness for the whiskey Margaret Pike sold at a discount to her friends. The torn envelope, the smudged ink, it all clicked into place, a piece of a puzzle he had not even known he was solving. Someone had altered his letter. Someone had deliberately erased the very words meant to prevent the humiliation he had suffered. He did not know why, but he knew with a cold certainty that his public rejection had not been an accident. It had been engineered. He set the hammer down. He looked at the half-finished pump mechanism on his anvil, a thing of his own hands, a thing of integrity. He looked out the door at the rising skeleton of the water tower, a structure built on trust and shared effort. He had been made a fool of, but he was not a fool. He was a builder, and he would finish what he had started. The tower grew. It rose from the frozen ground like a great wooden spine, a testament to shared purpose. First 10 feet, a skeleton of fresh-cut pine that smelled of resin and cold air. Then 15 feet, a lattice against the sky that seemed both impossibly fragile and stubbornly strong. Finally, the main frame reached its full height of 20 feet, and from its peak, Caleb Thorne could see Dry Willow laid out below him like a map. From this height, the town looked different. It looked smaller, more peaceful. The lines of the streets were clean, the houses were neat boxes puffing smoke from their chimneys, and the people were tiny figures moving with unseen purpose. He could see the whole of it, not just the faces that had laughed at him or the windows that had hidden watching eyes. He saw the mercantile, the church, the saloon, and the scattered cottages. And he saw a small plot of land behind one of those cottages, where a lone figure in a dark dress was bent over, tending to rows of what looked like early peas. It was Ruth Callahan's garden. He watched her for a long time, her movements patient and deliberate as she worked the cold earth. From up here, she did not look scarred or plain. She looked like a part of the land itself, enduring and vital. The work was hard and honest. The town began to change its posture toward him. The whispers did not entirely cease, but their tone shifted from mockery to a kind of grudging wonder. Men who had once averted their gazes now gave him a curt nod as he passed. "Good day, Thorne." Women would pull their children aside, not in fear, but to point. That is the man building the new water tower. He began to walk through the town with his shoulders back, his head held not in defiance, but in simple, quiet possession of the space he occupied. He no longer felt the need to apologize for his own existence. Of course, the thaw was not universal. He heard the talk that filtered back from the mercantile, the sour grapes of Margaret Pike's circle. He is only doing it to curry favor, they would say, building a monument to himself over the heads of orphans. Hugh Morrison heard the talk too. The old smith sat with Caleb by the forge one evening, the two of them sharing a companionable silence as the fire died down. He spoke without looking at Caleb, his voice the rough sound of a file on iron. "Do not let your knees buckle just because another man's tongue is sharp. A dog barks at what it does not understand. You just keep your eyes on the work." It was good advice. Caleb held on to it. One afternoon, as the main platform of the tower was being finished, Ruth appeared below. She was not carrying a basket this time. She stood at the base of the ladder and looked up, her hands shielding her eyes from the sun. Caleb climbed down to meet her. "I want to see it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" he asked. "What you see from up there." He looked from her face, pale and determined, to the top of the tower. "It is a long way up. The wind is strong." "I know," she said. "I am not fond of high places, but I want to understand." He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, and he saw the resolve that was stronger than the fear. He had never met anyone quite like her. He simply nodded and gestured to the ladder. "After you." She started up, her movements stiff and uncertain. He followed close behind, his large frame a protective shield between her and the empty air. He did not touch her, but she could feel his presence, a steady warmth at her back. When she faltered on a rung, his voice was a low rumble just below her. "It is solid. I built it myself." They reached the top platform, a wide, secure square of planking with a simple railing. The wind was a physical force, pulling at their clothes and whipping tears from their eyes. Ruth gripped the railing with white knuckles, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to look down. "The whole world looks different," she breathed, the words snatched away by the wind. Caleb stood beside her, giving her space. "This is how I see it all the time. Everything at a distance." She turned to him then, her fear momentarily forgotten. Is that why you are so quiet? Because you are always looking down on the rest of us? The question was blunt, but not unkind. It was honest. He considered it. I suppose it is part of it. When you are this size, you learn to move carefully, you learn to speak softly. You spend your life trying not to break things. You try not to frighten people. After a while, the quiet gets to be a habit. I understand that, she said, her eyes meeting his. I spent a long time trying to hide my hand, wearing gloves in the summer, keeping it in my pocket, trying to make people forget it was there. I did not want them to ask. I did not want to see them flinch. Caleb looked at the puckered scar tissue, the shiny skin that pulled tight across her knuckles. He felt a profound sense of connection, a recognition that went deeper than words. Two people, marked as different by the world, standing together on a platform 20 feet in the air. "And do you still hide it?" he asked. She held her hand up, letting the wind blow over it. "No, it is part of me. It is the price I paid for pulling my brother from a fire. It is a reminder that I was strong when I needed to be. I will not apologize for it anymore." Caleb felt something shift inside him, a final lock clicking open. "I will not apologize for my height anymore," he said, and the words felt like a vow. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind swirling around them. The world spread out at their feet. The shadow of the tower they had built stretched long across the snow, its dark finger touching the roof of the Juniper orphanage. It was a shadow of protection. In her garden below, he could see the faintest hints of green where her peas were pushing their way through a patch of late frost, a stubborn proclamation of life. "It is time to go down," he said gently. She nodded, her courage beginning to fray. The descent looked even more frightening than the ascent. He went first, moving down 2 rungs. "Now you," he said, looking up at her. He held out his hand. She hesitated for only a second before placing her scarred hand in his. His was huge, warm, completely enveloping hers. It was the first time they had touched. "You mind the rungs," he said, his voice a promise. "I will mind the rest." She descended, her eyes on the ladder, her hand secure in his. He guided her, his grip firm and reassuring, his body a steady anchor. When her feet touched the solid ground, she leaned against the tower for a moment, her legs trembling. He let go of her hand, and the loss of contact felt like a sudden chill. "Thank you," she said, not looking at him. He only nodded. From that day on, something had changed. The looks he got from the townsfolk were different. The respect was still there, but now it was tinged with something warmer. They had seen Ruth Callahan, a woman they all knew and respected for her quiet fortitude, place her trust in him. And if she trusted him, then perhaps they could too. The foreshadowing of trouble came, as it often did. In the smoky confines of the Silver Bell Saloon, young Daniel, sent on an errand for his father, was waiting for a sack of grain when he saw a man he did not recognize at the bar. The man was dressed for the trail, with a hard, mean face and eyes that were never still. Daniel watched as the man bought 2 heavy boxes of rifle cartridges and, more strangely, a small, heavy keg of blasting powder. The bartender asked what he needed so much powder for. The stranger just smiled, a cold, thin line. "For spring cleaning," he said, and paid in gold coin. The news that the supply wagon had finally braved the pass came on a wind that carried the promise of more snow. It was scheduled to arrive at the mouth of Devil's Backbone Pass at dusk. But the report from the saloon about the stranger buying blasting powder had poisoned the relief with a new, sharp anxiety. It was too much of a coincidence. Reverend Whitaker called the small group together in the forge. The air was thick with the smell of hot iron and concern. "We cannot let that wagon be taken. Everything we need to finish the tower is on it. The sheeting, the main pipe, the last of the bolts. We will go meet it," Caleb said. It was not a question. It was a statement of intent. He had already selected the heaviest of his forging hammers, its weight a comforting reality in his hand. Samuel Boone, his face pale but resolute, nodded. "I will not let those ruffians steal the materials I sold to this town at cost." He held up a Winchester rifle that looked almost like a toy in his plump hands. Young Daniel stood tall, his fear a visible tremor that he fought to control. "I am with you." "That is 4 of us," the Reverend said, pulling on a heavy coat. "Enough to make a show of force. We will ride out an hour before sunset." A voice from the doorway made them all turn. "Make it 5." Ruth Callahan stood there, a coil of rope over her shoulder and a small, polished mirror in her hand. Her face was set, her gaze unwavering. "This is not for you." "Ruth," Caleb said immediately, his voice harsher than he intended. "It is too dangerous." She walked into the forge, right up to him, and did not flinch from his size or his tone. "The danger is to the wagon is for the tower is for the children. That makes it my business." She held up the mirror. "I know this pass better than any of you. There is a high trail that overlooks the narrowest point. The sun will be setting behind us. I can catch the last of its light and signal you if there is trouble ahead. It is faster and quieter than a gunshot." He wanted to argue. He wanted to order her to stay behind where it was safe. But he looked into her eyes and saw the same unyielding strength he had seen when she climbed the tower. She was not asking for his protection. She was offering her help. To refuse it would be to insult the very core of who she was. "All right," he said, his voice low, "but you will take the high trail, and you will signal at the first sign of anything. Then you will ride back. You will not come down into the pass." She gave a single, sharp nod, agreed. They rode out as the sun began its slow descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of apricot and rose. The air grew colder, and a thin, spectral mist began to rise from the ground, clinging to the rocks and dead trees. Ruth split off from them at the base of the pass, her small mare scrambling up the steep, rocky trail with the sureness of a mountain goat. The 4 men rode on, entering the deep shadows of Devil's Backbone. The pass was a jagged scar in the earth, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. The wind moaned through the narrow gap, and the mist thickened, muffling sound and turning the world into a shifting landscape of gray shapes. The silence was heavy, unnatural. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the clink of horseshoes on stone. They were halfway through when a flash of light, bright and impossibly sharp, blinked from the ridge high above them. It was Ruth's signal. 1 flash, 2, 3, the prearranged signal for an ambush ahead. Caleb reined in his horse, holding up a hand. "They are here." Before the words had fully left his mouth, the quiet was shattered. A rifle shot cracked from the rocks ahead, the sound echoing and re-echoing, making it impossible to tell where it had come from. The bullet screamed past Caleb's head and slammed into the rock wall behind him, spraying stone chips. The horses panicked, rearing and whinnying, their eyes wide with terror. Another shot, and then another. They were pinned down, exposed. "Get to the rocks!" Caleb roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. He slid from his saddle, keeping the bulk of his horse between himself and the unseen gunman. He saw the others scrambling for cover, a desperate, clumsy dance amidst the panicked animals. Then he looked up toward the ridge. He could not see Ruth, but he knew she was up there, alone. He did not think. He ran. He ran back the way they had come, toward the mouth of the pass, toward the trail she had taken. He ignored the bullets that whined past him, the shouts of his companions. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his size, his long legs eating up the ground. He found her just as she was coming down the trail, leading her horse, her face a mask of worry. He grabbed her arm, pulling her into the deep shadow of an overhanging boulder. The shooting behind them intensified, a steady, deadly rhythm. She stumbled against him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He pressed her back against the cold stone, his body a shield in front of hers. A bullet ricocheted off the rock face above their heads, its sound a high, angry insect buzz. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his chest, or maybe it was his own. The world had shrunk to this small, protected space, to the smell of pine and cold stone and the warmth of her body against his. She spoke, her voice a near whisper, almost lost in the wind. "Stay close, Cowboy." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer, feeling the delicate strength of her frame. He lowered his head until his lips were near her ear, the chaos of the gunfight fading to a distant drumbeat. Ain't no bullet could drive me away. He felt her tremble, but it was not from fear. In that moment, suspended between life and death, something profound and unspoken passed between them. He was not just protecting her. He was defending the one piece of solid ground he had found in a lifetime of drifting. The plan came to him then, born of fire and desperation. He had come prepared. He reached into his saddlebag, which he had slung over his shoulder, and pulled out a heavy, canvas-wrapped object. It was one of his creations from the forge, a noisemaker, nothing more, a thick iron casing packed with a small amount of blasting powder and sealed with a tarred leather plug. It would not send shrapnel. It was designed to create a concussive blast, a wall of sound and air. "They will expect us to stay pinned down," he said to her, "but the Reverend and the others know the plan. They are working their way around. I need you to get back up on that ridge. When you see them in position, use your mirror, give them a target." He saw the fear in her eyes again, but also the trust. She nodded. They switched places. He stood with his back to the rock, holding his heavy hammer, presenting a target while she scrambled back up the steep trail. He was a mountain, and he would not be moved. The bullets came closer now, the unseen shooters growing bolder. He could hear their rough shouts, their mocking laughter. Then he saw it. A single, bright flash from the ridge. Ruth was in position. He lit the short fuse on his device and, with a powerful, underhand swing, hurled it far into the pass. It landed with a dull thud in the rocks where the shots were thickest. He ducked back behind the boulder just as the world erupted in a deafening roar. The blast was immense, a physical blow that shook the very ground. It was followed by yells of surprise and pain from the ambushers. In the ringing silence that followed, he heard the crack of the Reverend's and Samuel's rifles from a new direction. They had flanked them. The ambush was broken. There were more shouts, a panicked scramble, and then the sound of men and horses crashing through underbrush, followed by loud, splashing sounds. When Caleb and the others finally advanced, they found 3 of the bandits floundering in a deep, icy marsh that bordered the pass, their weapons lost in the muck. The 4th, the man they presumed was Copper Jack, had escaped, but a trail of dark drops on the snow showed he had not done so unharmed. The supply wagon was safe. They returned to Dry Willow not as supplicants, but as heroes. The whole town seemed to be waiting for them. When Deputy Constance Porter, her face a mask of cold fury, stepped forward to confront Ruth, a low growl went through the crowd. "This woman interfered with an active situation," the deputy announced, her hand on her sidearm. "She placed herself and others in danger. I am placing her under arrest for obstructing justice." Margaret Pike, standing right behind her, nodded her vigorous approval. Before Caleb could move, Samuel Boone stepped in front of Ruth. "You will do no such thing. Constance, that woman saved my life. She saved all our lives. Her courage is the only reason those supplies are here and we are not lying dead in that pass." A chorus of agreement rose from the townspeople. They moved forward, a solid wall of neighbors, surrounding Ruth and her defenders. They stood between her and the law. Margaret Pike and Constance Porter found themselves suddenly, utterly alone. Their authority vanished into thin air. They backed away, their faces a mixture of shock and impotent rage. Later that night, as the town celebrated in the warm light of the saloon, Daniel found Caleb by the forge. He was holding a piece of paper, a shipping invoice from the post office. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I found this. It is from a few months back, before you came." Caleb took the paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, with a distinct, looping flourish on the letter P. He froze. It was the same handwriting he had seen on the altered section of his letter of application. The same looping P. He looked at the bottom of the invoice. It was signed by the person who had inspected the shipment, Deputy Constance Porter. The tower was finished. It stood tall and straight against the vast Colorado sky, its unpainted pines smelling of the forest and the future. The large wooden tank at its summit, clad in new iron strapping, looked like a crown. It was not just a structure of wood and metal. It was a monument to a community that had found its footing again. The entire town of Dry Willow gathered at its base. The children from the Juniper Orphanage stood at the front, their faces scrubbed and shining, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and excitement. Reverend Whitaker said a short, simple prayer of thanks, not to the heavens, but to the calloused hands that had done the work. Then, it was time. Caleb stepped forward and showed two of the oldest orphans how to work the long iron handle of the pump he had forged. It was a simple lever, but it was connected to the heart of the well deep below. The children put their small hands on the cold iron alongside Caleb's massive one. Together, they pushed down. The pump gave a great groaning clank, a sound of machinery waking from a long sleep. They pulled up and pushed down again. A rhythmic squeal and clank began, a new kind of bell for the town. For a moment, that was the only sound. Then, from high above, came another. It was a gurgle, then a rush, then a thunderous, joyous roar as the first clean, cold water poured into the empty tank. A cheer went up from the crowd, a single, unified sound of triumph. The children laughed and danced. Samuel Boone clapped the Reverend on the back, and even old Hugh Morrison was seen to crack a smile. The sound of that water was the sound of a community washing itself clean. It was the sound of life. That evening, the church was full again. But this time, the mood was not one of desperation, but of sober reckoning. Reverend Whitaker stood before them and explained that there was one final piece of business concerning the tower's construction that needed to be brought into the light. He called for Daniel Peterson. The young man, his voice shaking but clear, stepped forward and told the story of what he had overheard in the mercantile. He then produced the shipping invoice from the post office. He laid it on a table for all to see. Then Caleb stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply took from his pocket the original tattered letter he had sent to Dry Willow. He unfolded it and placed it beside the invoice. The evidence was plain. The elegant, looping P in Deputy Porter's signature was identical to the one in the forged line of his letter, the line that had erased his true height and paved the way for his humiliation. The rest of the script matched as well. Constance Porter stood near the back, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiant pride. She did not deny it. "Why would I?" she asked, her voice ringing with self-righteousness. "This town has standards, a reputation. We are an orderly community. I could not allow our new blacksmith to be a sideshow attraction. I did what was necessary to protect the character of Dry Willow from an unsuitable element. I was maintaining order." A stunned silence filled the church. Then all eyes turned to Margaret Pike. She stood slowly, her face pale. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, her formidable composure was gone. She looked not at Constance, but at the townspeople, her neighbors. And then she looked at Caleb. I never saw his real letter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Constance showed me the altered one. She told me he was trying to deceive us. I believed her." She looked from face to face, her pride finally breaking. "I was wrong. I trusted the wrong person." It was an admission that cost her everything, and in doing so, saved a small piece of herself. The next day, a petition was started by Samuel Boone. It circulated through the town, gathering signatures at the hardware emporium, the saloon, and on the church steps. It demanded the immediate dismissal of Deputy Constance Porter and a full review of the post office's procedures. By noon, it had been signed by nearly every adult in Dry Willow. The town council had no choice. Constance was stripped of her badge before the sun set. Caleb stood before the crowd that day, not as a defendant, but as a founder of this new chapter. He spoke, his voice low and steady. "I came here looking for a home. You have shown me that a home is not a place you find. It is a thing you build, together." That evening, as a soft snow began to fall, he found Ruth in her garden, covering her resilient pea shoots with burlap sacks against the coming cold. He stood for a moment, just watching her work. Then he cleared his throat. "I was wondering," he said, his voice feeling too large for the quiet space between them. "I was wondering if you might be willing to cook a dinner that was meant for only 2 people. She straightened up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked at him, and her rare, honest smile lit up her face. "I think," she said, "that could be arranged." Their meal was a quiet affair in her small, warm kitchen. They talked not of towers or ambushes, but of small things, of his father's shipyards and the smell of the sea, of her childhood in the mountains and the brother she had saved from the fire. It was an easy comfort, a weaving together of 2 solitary lives. For the first time, Caleb did not feel like a giant in a small room. He just felt like a man, sitting across from a woman he was beginning to realize he could not imagine his life without. But as Dry Willow celebrated its newfound unity, a shadow was creeping back toward it. A trapper, coming down from the high country, stopped at the saloon for a drink. He brought news. He had seen signs of a camp up near the old mining claims, the tracks of a half-dozen horses, and he had found a bloody bandage snagged on a bush. The men in the saloon exchanged uneasy glances. Copper Jack was still out there, wounded, angry, and with a long memory. The trapper also spoke of the weather. The old-timers in the high camps were all saying the same thing. The light snows were a bad sign. They were the prelude to a long, dry spell, a summer drought that would turn the forests to tinder. Suddenly, the new water tower was more than a symbol of community. It was their only real defense against a thirsty, fiery future, and it was a clear and shining target for a man bent on revenge. The heat of July settled over Dry Willow like a wool blanket. The sun was a merciless white eye in a bleached sky, and the earth, once dark and rich, had cracked into a mosaic of thirsty fissures. A hot, persistent wind blew from the south, carrying nothing but dust and the scent of baked pine. The creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the optimism of spring was a distant memory. But in the shadow of the great water tower, there was life. Ruth Callahan, her face shaded by a wide straw hat, had organized the women of the town. They had tilled a large communal plot, using the tower's precious, rationed water with a miser's care. She taught them the old ways of dry farming, of building mulch barriers to hold moisture, of watering at the base of each plant, drop by precious drop. In this circle of shared effort, her scarred hand was not a mark of difference, but a symbol of knowledgeable, capable leadership. Amidst the cracked plains, their shared garden was a stubborn, defiant patch of green, a testament to hope that refused to wither. The first real casualty of the summer was not a crop, but a man. Hugh Morrison died as he had lived for the past few years quietly. He simply went to sleep in his small cottage behind the forge and did not wake up. There was no struggle, no sickness. His heart, worn out from 80 years of hard work and honest living, had simply decided it was time to rest. The funeral was small and simple, held in the cool of the church. The whole town came. They remembered him not with grand eulogies, but with shared stories of his gruff kindness, of a tool mended for a child, of a fair price charged in a hard winter. Caleb did not speak. His grief was too large for words. The day after the funeral, he went into the forest and found a perfect, straight-grained piece of hickory. He spent the entire day in the forge, not with fire, but with a draw knife and sandpaper. He carved a new handle for a blacksmith's hammer, smooth and perfectly balanced, a thing of beauty and purpose. He took it to the small cemetery and placed it on the fresh mound of earth. It was a craftsman's promise, a silent vow to keep the forge lit, to honor the trade that had been passed into his care. Reverend Whitaker found him there, standing over the grave as the sun set. "The old man left you a letter." "Caleb," he said softly, handing him a sealed envelope. Caleb opened it. Hugh's handwriting was a crabbed, difficult scrawl, but the words were clear. "The forge and the cottage are half yours," it read. "The other half is yours when you pay the town what I still owed on the land. Pay it off. and the deed is in your name. You are a smith. A smith needs a forge. Do not let the fire go out." The threat of Copperjack had faded with the summer heat, becoming a ghost story told to frighten children. But ghosts sometimes return. The town had organized a quiet night watch, a handful of men who took turns walking the silent streets. Caleb often took the last watch, from midnight until dawn. The deep silence of the high country no longer felt lonely to him. It felt like home. It was on one of these nights, when the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, that he saw it, a single furtive shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows near the orphanage. He was not alone. Samuel Boone was on watch with him that night. The two men exchanged a silent look and melted back into the darkness. They watched as the figure, followed by two others, crept toward the base of the water tower. One of them was carrying a small, heavy keg, blasting powder. There was no thought of waiting, no time to gather more men. Caleb and Samuel moved, circling around in the darkness. They were joined by Jack Peterson and his son Daniel, who had been woken by a neighbor's barking dog. The four of them closed in, a silent, determined ring of ordinary men protecting their own. They caught them completely by surprise. The men were too focused on setting the charge at the base of a main support timber. Caleb's voice was a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I would not light that fuse if I were you." The men spun around, their faces pale in the faint starlight. One of them was Copperjack, his arm in a sling, his face twisted with hate. His two companions were hired thugs, their eyes wide with panic. One of them dropped the keg with a heavy thud. Jack lunged, not for a weapon, but at Caleb, a desperate, wild charge. It was a mistake. Caleb did not meet his charge with equal fury. He simply planted his feet, absorbed the man's momentum, and used it against him. It was a short, brutal, and almost silent struggle. Caleb disarmed him, pinned his good arm, and brought him to the ground with an ease that was terrifying. He did not hit him. He did not need to. He simply held him, his immense strength an unbreakable cage, until the fight went out of the man. The other two surrendered without a struggle to Samuel and Jack. The next morning, the sheriff from Junction City came and took Copperjack and his men away. This time, there would be no escape. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The last shadow had been chased away. That evening, Caleb walked to Ruth's cottage. The heat of the day was finally breaking, and a cool breeze was beginning to stir. He found her on the front steps of her porch, shelling peas from their communal garden into a large wooden bowl. The rhythmic snap of the pods was a peaceful, domestic sound. He sat on the step below her, not speaking for a long time. She was the one who broke the silence, her voice as calm and steady as her hands. "I have grown accustomed to the shadow of that tower," she said, not looking at him. "It keeps the worst of the afternoon sun off my house. I have been thinking I would like to build a permanent home in that shadow, a home with a porch and a fence, and maybe a room big enough for a man who has to duck his head to get through the door." Caleb's heart felt like his hammer striking the anvil, a great, booming stroke. He reached into his pocket and took out two things, the key to the Forge cottage, and the folded, worn letter from Hugh Morrison. He did not say a word. He just held them out to her. She stopped shelling the peas. She wiped her hands on her apron and took the key and the letter. She read the old smith's words, her expression softening. Then she looked at the key, resting in her scarred palm. "Is this an answer?" she asked, her gaze finally meeting his. "It is," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "It is the only answer I have. Hugh gave me a start. I will work to pay off the rest. The forge is my trade. The cottage it is a place to begin." He took a deep breath. "I want to stay. Ruth, I want to grow with this place, with you." She closed her hand around the key, her grip firm. Then she smiled, her real, honest smile that made her whole face beautiful. "Good," she said, "because these peas will not cook themselves." He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound of pure relief. He took a pea pod from the bowl, split it open with his thumb. and ate the sweet, green jewels inside. The drought would eventually break, the seasons would turn, life would be hard, and it would be good. He had found his place, not by searching for it, but by building it, and he would not have to live in it alone. The dedication of the tower took place on a bright, clear Sunday after the church service. It was not a grand affair, but the whole town was there. Caleb, with the help of young Daniel, had affixed a bronze plaque to one of the main timbers at the base. He had hammered the letters himself, pouring the molten bronze into casts he had carved from wood. The words were simple, and they were Ruth's. Juniper Tower, for the children who do not choose where they are born. Reverend Whitaker asked Caleb if he wanted to say a few words. Caleb shook his head and simply gestured to the plaque. The words were all there. He then walked over to the pump and, with a single, easy motion, sent the sound of rushing water up into the tank. A life-giving heartbeat for the town. That was his speech. Their wedding took place a month later, in the churchyard, as the first aspen leaves were beginning to turn to gold. It was as simple and honest as they were. Ruth wore a plain blue dress, the color of a mountain sky just before dusk. Caleb wore a new shirt and a coat that for once did not feel too tight in the shoulders, custom made by the town's seamstress as a wedding gift. There was no formal reception, only a gathering of friends. It seemed the whole town considered themselves friends. The women brought cakes and pies. Samuel Boone provided a barrel of cider, and Jack Peterson played old sweet songs on a fiddle that had been his father's. The children from the orphanage, dressed in their Sunday best, chased each other through the yard, their laughter the real wedding music. Caleb noticed a figure standing at a distance, near the gate of the churchyard. It was Margaret Pike. She did not approach. She simply stood and watched for a few moments, her expression unreadable. Then, just before she turned to leave, she met Caleb's gaze across the yard and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not friendship. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet admission that the town was better for his presence. It was enough. The vows were short. They stood before the reverend, the shadow of the tower they had built together falling across them. They did not speak of love in flowery terms. They spoke of partnership, of respect, of a shared home. They promised to stand by each other, to work alongside each other, and to build a life together. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Caleb did not kiss his bride. He simply took her scarred hand in his, a quiet, powerful gesture that everyone there understood. Autumn came to the high country, a season of sharp, clean air and golden light. A new, handsomely carved sign hung over the forge, Thorn Ironworks. Inside, the fire was always lit, and the sound of a hammer on an anvil was a steady, reassuring rhythm in the town. Daniel Peterson was now Caleb's official apprentice, his lanky frame beginning to fill out with the hard, honest muscle of the trade. He was learning not just how to shape iron, but how to be a man of integrity, and he was a quick study in both. Caleb and Ruth lived in the small cottage behind the forge. With the money from the steady stream of work, they began to pay down the debt to the town, and they began to make the small house their own. Their most significant addition was a bench on the front porch. It was Caleb's design, and his own handiwork. It was a single bench, but it had 2 seat levels. One was low, at a normal height. The other, right beside it, was a good foot higher. It was here they sat in the evenings. As the sun went down behind the mountains, Ruth would sit on her side, and Caleb would sit on his. And for the first time in his life, he could sit beside a person he loved and be at eye level. They could sit, as she had once said, shoulder to shoulder, from their bench. They could watch the children playing in the yard of the Juniper orphanage, safe and secure, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. Their games played out in the long, protective shadow of the tower. The story of Caleb Thorne's arrival in Dry Willow was still told. The old-timers would tell it to newcomers over a beer in the Silver Bell Saloon. They still told the part about the train, and the public rejection, and the laughter. They still called him the mail-order husband who was turned away for being too tall. But the ending of the story had changed. It was no longer a joke. It was a legend. It was the story of a man who was offered humiliation and chose dignity instead. It was the story of a man who refused to be moved, who stood his ground until the ground itself became his home. And it was the story of a quiet woman with a scarred hand who knew the value of a person not by their size, but by the straightness of their gaze. A woman who spoke the truth when no one else would, and who took his hand and walked with him through the storm. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.